Hello and welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast where we help you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and the Anzac Day weekend that was round 7 is now in the books. It was another long weekend of footy, and with the short work weeks we've had, which have been very welcomed, that's for sure, it just feels like we've had footy on for most days across the last few weeks, which has been awesome. So I've enjoyed it. I hope you have too. This round started back on Thursday night with the traditional Anzac Day Eve clash between Melbourne and Richmond, which saw the D's put their foot down in the second half against a plucky Tigers outfit. And then the big one on Friday, the big Anzac Day clash, and saw Collingwood continue to flex their muscle at the top of the table as Essendon tried but ultimately couldn't get near the Pies. The rest of the weekend was pretty entertaining, and I actually found it was a pretty high scoring weekend for fantasy. There were 15 players across the league who went 120 or more, and I just don't think we've seen that many weeks so far this year. So possibly with a bit of colder weather settling in, we might see some higher fantasy scores coming up. Coming up on Finders Keepers today, on this week's episode, we have plenty of talking points as I go through the things I noticed, including some high praise for a young Tiger, an early call on a Carlton defensive prospect, and a bit of an out of left field idea for West Coast to get a young star flying again. All of that plus my top waiver wire picks, as well as a couple of questions at the end from you, the valued listener. So here's what I noticed across the weekend, starting with Melbourne and Richmond on Thursday night. Thompson Dow had a really good game, probably the best, maybe one of the best of his career. Certainly had career high disposals and just starting to look like he belongs at the level. It was always going to be a year for him to step up, with Richmond giving a lot of opportunity to those younger guys, but Dow's been one that's been floating around for a while and hasn't quite got the scoring yet, but on the weekend he had a really good score, and I think he should just continue to grow and grow. Now, I want to talk about something I saw during the game. It wasn't necessarily a footy act, but it really stayed with me. At some point, I reckon in the first half, young Steely Green for Richmond gave away a 50-metre penalty or something to that effect, gave up a goal. And you could see on the telecast he was walking away and he wasn't arguing with the ump, he was just in his own head, frustrated at his mistake. And I remember thinking right then and there, I wonder which Tiger leader is going to walk over to him and, give him a pat on the back, say, don't worry about it. And for the first couple of seconds, no one went over to him. And I thought, come on, someone get around the kid. And then, there was a cutaway that cut back, and you'll never guess who it was. It was young 6-game player Sam Lawler, who had his arm around Green, saying words, I can only imagine, were to the effect of, hey, don't worry about it, on to the next contest, chin up, so something along those lines. And I just thought, wow, that is big for a first-year player to go over there and do that. And I know that probably goes on a lot, and this is just what was caught on the cameras. But it really stayed with me, because I think in the next maybe not next passage of play, but within 5 to 10 minutes, Steely Green snapped a really good goal and was up and about. And I just thought, not only do Richmond have, the number 1 draft pick, Sam Lawler, going to be a brilliant footballer, but I just thought already, I reckon they've got themselves a young leader, and it really stood out to me. Over to the Melbourne side of things, Jake Bowie is looking to be one of the picks of the season across the formats. He is having a fantastic start to the year, and probably behind Max Gawn was the best player on the ground. I think in this particular game there was him and the likes of Christian Salem, Trent Rivers, Xavier Lindsay. There are a whole group of them that just feasted on a lot of the ball, lots of uncontested ball in the back half. But it was Bowie who I thought looked the most damaging. So if you look at just fantasy scores, they all scored really well. But I think in terms of impact, Bowie was, he was fantastic. And I remember when he he bobbed up a few weeks ago and had a couple of good scores, and there was concern that, but once Stephen May returns, that could be the end of it. Nah, he's just gone on with it and is looking like having a really good year and being a really good player long term. Just quickly on Xavier Lindsay, it was great to see him running around and getting lots of footy. I was lucky enough to pick him up in a keeper league this year, and a mate in the group chat was saying he's looking like a Sheasel 2.0. I reckon it might be a little premature for that, but it was certainly pretty cool to hear. But it does look like he's following a similar path in terms of his ability to find the ball right from the start. And, if it weren't for that knee injury, which thankfully wasn't serious, which just sort of interrupted his momentum, who knows what he'd be scoring right now. So very happy to have him, and hopefully the scoring continues. On to Anzac Day, and it would be remiss of me not to talk about this guy, Jack Crisp. Didn't have an amazing game or anything, but he equalled a record in footy that I never thought would ever be broken. So he's equalled Jim Stein's record of consecutive games at 244 games. Now, I remember when Jim Steins broke that record many years ago. I was only a kid. And in the years after, I marvelled at that record. How could a player in then, the 90s, 2000s, in that era, let alone in this current one that we have now, pretty much go 10 years of never missing a game in the AFL. It's an incredible record, and he's been a brilliant player for a long time, Crisp. And I'm just so glad he got there. I don't know, I'm sure Collingwood fans aware of the record would have felt this, and not even a Collingwood fan myself, but I was so scared in the last few weeks he'd pick up a niggle or a concussion or a suspension or something awful that would mean he missed the record. So he just has to play this week to overtake Steins. And from memory, Jim Steins had I think it was a broken hand that finally sidelined him after 10 years. So it'll be interesting to see what it is that ends the run for Crisp, and it may well just be one day he retires. Wouldn't that be something? On to more fantasy-relevant discussions. Ben Hobbs moved onto the ball in the last quarter to cover for Dylan Shield, who went off with... They're saying it's just cramp at this point, but I guess it wouldn't be a huge surprise if he was to have a week off, Dylan Shield. Not for form, just with his age and if he's a little bit sore. So Hobbs moved into that role, and I don't know. I don't know how many times I can keep talking up Hobbs as possibly being something in this game, but it still just doesn't look like it. I reckon what we'll see this week, especially if Sheila's out, is Elijah Sardis' return. He had a big game in the VFL the week before, and then on the weekend just gone, was pulled from the VFL game. And with Essendon playing on Thursday, Thursday this week, I think there's a good chance we'll see him back. And then another Essendon guy, Zach Johnson from the draft, just gone. Just keep an eye on him, because I reckon he's getting close to a debut. His VFL form's been really good, and I think he's someone to keep an eye on. He's a real good user of the footy, and I think when he gets his chance, he could be a decent scorer. On to Anzac Day night, Friday night footy, which saw Freo put in probably their best performance of the season and were way too good for Adelaide, which was disappointing. Now, a talking point during the week was, for Freo, who's going to pick up the slack left behind by Jaeger O'Meara, who was out with an injury? And there were some queries on, would we see Neil Erasmus come back in? Would Matty Johnson get a bit of an uptick in CBAs? What was it going to look like? And as it turned out, Erasmus wasn't recalled to the side, and Matty Johnson did have a slight uplift in the CBAs, not a huge amount, just a little, but it was enough for him to put out a season high score and put in a really good game. So it's a real interesting mix at Freo with the amount of midfielders they do have. You've obviously got Sarong, Brayshaw and Hayden Young as the main ones, O'Meara when he's not injured, and then there's just a little bit of a sprinkling of others. Just Shea Bolton looked pretty good in there as well for the few times he went in and had a really good game overall. So they're an interesting mix, Freo, but whatever they did on the weekend, it worked very well. So I would imagine we'll see more of it in the future. For the Crows, wasn't a great night for the Crows. Jordan Dawson went forward in the last quarter and went statless. Just absolutely nothing. Nada. And Sid Draper had been subbed in and he went into the middle. And I guess they were just trying to get something going with Dawes forward. But yeah, not a good way to end the game for him with a 0 in the last quarter. And I think the Crows need him in the midfield. Speaking of Sid Draper, he went back to being the sub this week, which I found a bit strange, if I'm honest. I mean, if you look at Draper, he came in, I think the first few weeks of the year he was the sub. Then he got elevated, promoted to a full game and wasn't the sub for a few weeks. And he's just been a little bit off, he's a first-year player. So then they make him the sub again. I just think if you're going to pull him back to being a sub, just give him the week off and let him get some confidence in the sandful, which they did. So the Crows played Friday night with Draper playing, maybe nearly a quarter, just that last quarter. And then he went and played in the sandful the next day or on Sunday and carved it up. So he played both. But I don't know. I just think he was the sub. He's either now on field for 4 quarters or he's not up to the level and he needs a spell in the twos. I just don't think it should be in between. St Kilda Brisbane, we saw Naziah Wanganeen-Miller. Jeez, he's everywhere. He just continues to be the everywhere man. He takes kick-ins. He attended, I think, a season-high amount of CBAs, and he kicked a goal, so he's hitting the scoreboard. Yeah, up to 56% CBAs, and he's just everywhere. And it was a huge score from him. I just think anyone who's got him would be loving life, because it's not like the CBAs are going to continue to increase to a point that you have to worry about him losing defender status. It just means he's literally all over the field, and his scoring is is reflective of that. Brad Hill has put together a nice block of scores. Looks like he's roaming a bit more free, playing wing, a little bit of half back. He's had some pretty shocking games the last couple of years as he's sort of gotten older and whatnot. But yeah, I don't know. He looked pretty good. He has forward status still. It's just a risky one, isn't it? He's probably more of a guy you'd want to grab and stream and have a look at first, because, I don't know, I've just got memories of him scoring like 30s and 40s in the last few years, which is painful. Speaking of painful, Hugo Garcia owners, coaches who own that man, would just be banging their head against a wall. No, maybe not quite that extreme. He's just been up and down, and having him as the sub, and then, geez, it was strange on the weekend. I know St Kilda were not going well and they were shocking last week, but to do a tactical sub, like, I don't know, halfway through the second quarter, was it? Man, that's rough on a kid. I think he's 19. I think he's been far from their worst performer. And I don't know, again, it's like, just put him in the VFL for a few weeks if you're not happy with what he's doing. But yeah, to pull him... Anyway, I don't know. Saints fans, you'll know more than me about him. And obviously, Ross Lyons, he knows what he's doing. I found it really strange. But from a fantasy point of view, it's just a nightmare, because when he plays 4 quarters and gets that midfield role, he tends to score. He tackles his way to a decent score, and he's very fieldable as a forward option. But it's just a little bit too scary now. So we'll see what happens with him, and you'd think he'd be out now and have a stint in the VFL, because otherwise it's just too hard to predict. Anthony Caminiti, he moved forward in the second half, and as a result, his scoring dried up. I wonder if that experiment's over, him as a defender. It was producing okay scores in fantasy, but I just wonder if he needs to go forward, particularly with that news that Max King is unlikely to be seen till, well, much, much later in the season at this point. Port Adelaide versus North Melbourne ended up being a pretty close game. North had a real crack, which was good, but Port did what they had to do. Just a couple of players I wanted to touch on. Colby McKercher is... Look, he's a second-year player, but there was a lot of hype about his fantasy credentials. And we saw a bit of it last year. We're just not seeing much this year. And I know a lot of it is the role. He's got a terrible role at the moment. I think it's like a half-forward type. But I don't know. He's just starting to worry me. He hasn't put up a good score all year. And I know he's a second-year player, but there are other second-year players who are scoring pretty good and you can field them. I would have thought McKercher would be in that category, but he just isn't at the moment. Hopefully there's a role change coming up soon for him and we can see him just up the ground a bit more and see if he can accumulate the footy like we know he's going to when he's a bit older and more experienced and playing as a midfielder. For Port Adelaide, I've been pretty impressed with Sam Powell-Pepper's season. He's put together a pretty good one, playing as a pressure forward, involved in linking the play and setting up the attack, but also tackling hard on the way out. And he's always been a handy scorer. He's been a guy in drafts that you'll see pop up with a decent score, then you grab him, and then he burns you with a stinker. But he's been really consistent this year, and if he's available in your leagues, which he just could still be, because even though he's put together a few good ones in a row, coaches will look and remember that he's burnt them in the past. But he's absolutely an option, and I think would be worth grabbing just with that forward status still there, and probably likely to keep it because that's the role he's playing. It's kind of like a bit like Ben Keys in Adelaide, that role, and just it can be quite fruitful even without kicking bags of goals. The Giants and the Bulldogs. This was a great result for the Bulldogs. Game was neck and neck at half time, and then the Doggies just went bang. Great win for them. Some players I noticed in this game, Lockie Ash just keeps going from strength to strength. There were heaps of marks for him, Whitfield, Buckley, Taylor, plenty, but Ash is playing so well, and he's reaching a level I actually didn't think he could get to, perhaps until maybe we saw Lockie Whitfield retire. I mean, the way he's going, that's still years away anyway. But Lockie Ash owners, if you've held him all this time, you'd be very happy to see this output now. Hopefully it continues. Jake Riccardi put in a good game. Just good to see him get a ton. He plays a really good role, just some weeks doesn't get near it at all. But I do like the way he plays as a forward who chops out in the ruck, and he's got that real agility about him, and he kind of almost like a Jeremy Cameron type, getting up the field. We haven't seen it much, but this was a great game for him. Actually, the ruck split with him and Briggs was interesting. So it was nearly a 40-60 split in ruck contests across the ground. So nearly 40% to Riccardi and 60 to Briggs. I'm not sure what's going on with Briggs. His last 2 weeks have been very bad. I can just only put it down to a rough couple of weeks. See if he can bounce back this week. But owners, don't stress just yet. But you're going to want to see something, this week. Darcy Jones. I really enjoy watching this guy play. The role seems to be a bit stronger with Brent Daniels out at the moment, and he's out for a few more weeks yet. But Jones just makes things happen. And I don't know if I notice him more because he's wearing a helmet, but every time I see him, he's making something happen, making the play. He's really quick and really clean, and he's the guy who a few weeks ago scored 123 against West Coast. And I think we all kind of thought, well, that's one out of the box. And he hasn't got anywhere near that since, but it looks like he's going to be a pretty good scorer in the future, and he's already doing okay with 60s and 70s. over to the Bulldogs, who would, as I said, be absolutely stoked with that win. It was a really impressive one on the road, and considering they lost Sam Darcy last week, they just kept going and found the goals anyway. Probably worth giving Matt Kennedy a bit of a rev up. I mean, what a season he's having. And I'm not really surprised. He showed at Carlton when he was given the CBAs and proper time on ground. And by proper time on ground, I mean full games, no sub action. And when he's had those things, he's been a really good scorer because he's just a really good midfielder. And, it does beg the question, what were Carlton not seeing in him? But with Carlton's decision to move him on, yes, Kennedy's killing it, but so's Hewitt at Carlton. So maybe Hewitt wouldn't have been doing what he's doing if Kennedy had stayed. Anyway, whatever the case, Matt Kennedy, forward status, having a cracking year. And the way it's going, he won't have forward status next year. So owners, could be a time to sell high, but I reckon just enjoy the ride. He's great to watch. James Harms, I mean, I've been blown away by how good he's been this year. The fantasy scoring has been probably but one game has been really solid. And on the weekend, I mean, he kicked 4 goals to score his 90. So, he's not going to do that every week. Some of the goals he kicked, though, were just... he's just on fire at the moment. So another guy you'd be happy to just have for now, but not a long-term prospect. We saw a much-awaited debut for young Bulldog Jed Busslinger, and I thought it was a pretty good debut for a key position defender to debut in what was very slippery conditions, playing on last year's Coleman medalist. I think he held his own, and I'd be pretty surprised if they moved him on and brought Jones straight back in. What I liked about him, though, from a keeper league perspective is, he's a stopper, he's a key defender, but you can already see in the way he plays that he's going to be the type who wants the footy, who wants that handball receive after the give off, who wants not the cheapies around the ground, but he wants the ball in his hands. And I think he's going to be one of those key defenders that actually score well. Not just yet, but down the track. And then lastly, just a quick comment on Marcus Bontempelli, another really good game. And the reason I bring him up is that there's a bit of a trend I'm seeing this year that feels different to other years with the sub and the use of the sub rule. I feel like we're seeing clubs use that sub on players who are not injured late in games just to give them an extra breather ahead of the next game. We saw the Crows do it earlier in the year with Rankin. He came off at three-quarter time. They did it again with Laird. And I couldn't think of any other examples, but I just feel like this year there's been a bunch of times where players are getting subbed off when there's nothing wrong with them. And that was clearly what happened with Bontempelli on the weekend. It's brutal in fantasy if you've got him, especially a Bont, if you had the captaincy on him or something like that. He was on track for another big score, but that's the game now. You got to be careful. Gold Coast Sydney, Chad Warner, that's more like it. Signed the contract, staying a Swan, and just played like a man who had the shackles removed. We knew he had it in him, and hopefully for owners that's closer to what you get to see week to week now, because that opening month of the year was really, really strange. But it did help him pick up forward status, and if he goes on and has a decent year, he could be one of the best forwards to have. Nick Blakey, the Lizard, he went forward in the last quarter. So Swans were just trying some different things and they put Blakey forward, and he kicked 3 goals, which I don't think Nick Blakey owners would have wanted to see that. They would have said, hey, don't do well as a forward, we need you in the back line. Just in terms of scoring. But no, I think even though he kicked the 3, that's cool. That's good. They know that they've got that up their sleeve. But I'd be pretty surprised if there were any actual changes to the role he plays, just purely because of what he brings them off half back. He brings drive almost unlike any other player in the comp. Carlton Geelong was a really big game. We saw the Blues hold on and looks like they're getting their season well and truly back on track. Geelong, they'll lick their wounds and come back even harder next week. I want to talk about George Hewitt. I mentioned how well Matt Kennedy's going at the Bulldogs. And with his departure, it's opened the door for George Hewitt to play more of a consistent midfield role. And would you believe, after 7 rounds, he has 7 tons. He just keeps going. Now, he had a slower start in this game. He was getting the pill, but just not a lot of marks and tackles early. And I was a bit worried that, this could be the week he just misses the ton. He was only on 70 at three-quarter time. Not an issue for Huey. Went bang in the last quarter with just a lazy 44 points, including kicking the ceiling goal just to cap off another great game from him. What a year he's having. Harry Mackay, what a performance, particularly that second half. He stood up and just reminded everyone how good he is. It was great to see, a guy who's had some struggles and he's been open and honest about some of those mental demons that he's been facing, which I think is really brave. So it was just great to see him back out there doing what he loves and doing it bloody well. And him and Charlie Curnow, the band is back together, and that's trouble for the rest of the league. And the keeper league owners who have endured what's been a very frustrating start to the season for both players could start to be rewarded. Over to the Cats, and we have Finders Keepers Player of the Week, Bailey Smith. Huge performance. Another big game from him. 29 touches of the footy, 5 marks, 9 tackles, and an electrifying goal in that last quarter that brought the Cats back to 10 points, and it was game on. He's been brilliant, and I think we all had some, not doubts, but it was just going to be a bit of a wait and see just how he'd fit into that midfield, that Geelong side. And maybe you just have to be a little patient to see the scoring. He has hit the ground running in 2025, and apart from an 80 last week, he's scored a ton in every game. I think it's going to be pretty hard to see anyone else claim the F1 spot from him this year. And of course, it will be his last year as a forward. Midfield status, midfielder only next year, you'd think. But it doesn't matter because he's young and he is just flourishing at the Cats. Max Holmes is, maybe it's harsh to say this, but he's just fast becoming a disappointment in 2025. And perhaps he was better suited to a halfback role than on the ball, because he's having games where he's on the ball and he's got all the opportunities to get it, and it is just going past him. And he's putting out some pretty frustrating scores. And we saw what he can do. That game against Adelaide in Gather Round, probably one of the best games of his career. But I remember that night thinking that's what he is. He's an absolute gun midfielder. But I don't know, he's just been a little bit off the boil the last few weeks. And, one of the strengths of Holmes as an option last year was that, he could have a bad day and he'd still get up to an 80. He had a really high basement score, but this year he's scored 60s, 70s, and he's actually dragged himself to get there. So he's saving the scores late. So I'm scared there's a 50 around the corner. Who knows? He might just be tired. Cat's coming off a 5-day break. But, yeah, I think for this season, Holmes owners are going to want to see a bit more. But long term, he's still, very exciting prospect. And then just quickly, Sean Manor. That mature age player came in last year for the Cats. What a great player to have. I mean, obviously the forward status. Huge game on the weekend. And I think that was his 3rd or 4th game for the season. He had one down game. The rest have been all great in terms of scoring. And I love his score build on the weekend. I don't even think he kicked a goal. But he had 26 touches and laid 11 tackles, playing as a half forward, I guess. Great numbers. So you'd be stoked if you had him. The last game probably had the most talking points, so I'll try and whiz through them. Hawks and West Coast. I think Hawthorn just did what they had to do. Wasn't a standout performance from them, and West Coast showed signs, but clearly are still a long way off it. Henry Hustwaite. Now, if you follow the Finders Keepers X page at FindKeepAFL, you would have seen a tweet that went out just highlighting the fact that he might be a chance, Hustwaite, to get a call up to the senior squad on Thursday night, and he was, and he played really well. He played the 4 quarters, had plenty of CBAs, pretty much picked up the bulk of what was left behind by Connor Nash, who's out for the next 4. Dylan Moore picked up a handful as well. But yeah, it was mostly Hustwaite who picked it up. And he just looked good at level, and I think he's pretty safe to get games for the next few weeks anyway. I think it was the 3rd quarter, he had 11 touches in a quarter. Pretty impressive. So, yeah, he's an exciting prospect. Hawthorn have a lot of these guys. Cam McKenzie, Josh Ward. But, yeah, I don't know. Hustwaite looks all right. So just keep an eye on him. Bailey McDonald was the sub. And he came on at half-time, and I think he looked okay. He took a kick in, and he just looks like he wanted to take the game on. And there's another guy that I actually think he'll get a run now, because Scrimshaw looks like missing with concussion. Amon looks like missing with concussion. And I thought McDonald did pretty well in that second half, enough to get himself another gig. So be good to watch him go around again. Lloyd Meek, just continues his big season, having a real... I guess it's like last year was a breakout, but this is almost that next level of breakout. Anyway, he smashed Flynn in the hitouts. And Flynn, I thought, look, he was soundly beaten on the day, but he still stood up, I thought. He wasn't disgraced by any stretch, and I think he did some good things. So, again, I'd be surprised if Bailey Williams took his spot. I think Flynn's got the number 1 spot for now, and as long as he's performing reasonably well, I think he holds it, and I think he averages, at least 80-odd if he keeps that role. Jack Hutchinson, I think we talked about him a couple of weeks ago. Actually, yeah, it was after Gather Round. I had Geordie DeSena on, and we were just talking about his CBAs had just suddenly gone through the roof that week. And it's continued for a couple of weeks without any sort of scoring. I think he might have scored a 40-something last week. But this is the sort of guy who, if you see that role is there, if you grab him the week before he puts out a good score, you don't have to fight everyone for him. So he's been building towards this for a few weeks, and those huge CBA numbers continued, and he put up a 80-something score. He ran with Newcomb. But yeah, it was a career high score. He's got the forward status, and, West Coast are trying all sorts of things. I think they're going to stick with it. The good thing with Hutchinson so far is, he hasn't been great at accumulating and getting the footy, but he's tackling his way to a reasonable score. Well, on the weekend, it was a very good score. Brady Hoff. He picked up the CBAs left by Tim Kelly, who was out with injury. And I thought he played really well. Hoff's such an interesting guy. I think for a couple of years now, I think we've all kind of felt like he's got a really good fantasy game in him. And then when Shannon Hearn retired and you thought maybe he could become that guy, Liam Baker came across, and, they've got Duggan back there. There's a lot of names, but Hoff has just been playing as a lockdown guy, and his scoring has been so bad. You couldn't hold him unless you were in a very, very deep league. But now, with this new role, could this be the role that gives Hoff the opportunity to be what we thought he could be? And that's a half-decent fantasy scorer. I'm not sure if we'll see it again next week, if Tim Kelly returns. But if he keeps that role in the midfield, Brady Hoff, I think he's going to be a highly desired player with that defender status. Oscar Allen, the captain, played in defence behind the ball. I guess I could see why West Coast would try that. Put the leader behind the ball, straighten things up. I just think put him back in the forward line. let him kick some goals, let him get his confidence back, and let him lead from the front the way he was before all the silliness that's come out recently with conversations with rival coaches and whatnot, which has clearly had an effect on him. But putting him behind the ball to, get some easy footy in his hands, I don't know if that's the answer. And lastly, Harley Reid. And I've got some thoughts on Harley Reid. I just think, it might sound crazy, I just think it would be wise to at least consider dropping him down to the waffle for a couple of weeks. And I only say that sounds crazy because, he's a second-year player, so why not? But it's Harley Reid, and there's a lot of hype, a lot of talk, and he did things last year in his first year that was breathtaking. But this year, I don't know if it's the weight of expectation and, the challenge of having a new coach, the challenge of losing every week. I'm not sure what it is, but he's not impacting games. He's still doing things that take your breath away, like he'll take a big specky or he'll kick an amazing goal. But he's not impacting games, and he's giving away a lot of free kicks and getting involved in a lot of silly stuff in terms of, the argy-barge, which is fine. It's good to have a bee in your bonnet and to play on the edge. But when you're not impacting the game, I just think he's got to get back to basics. Only Jordan Sweet from Port Adelaide has given away more free kicks this season than Harley Reid, and Sweet's a ruckman, so you do tend to see the rucks involved in the frees more. I don't know. I just think he needs something. And they've tried him at halfback, they've tried him forward, they've tried him on the ball. I just think it's time he has a spell and goes back to the twos and carves it up, gets some confidence back. And then we'll see him back in the senior side, hopefully a little bit more settled, and he can continue to build on what we all know is going to be a long and successful AFL career. And hopefully for owners in keeper leagues, fantasy career as well. On to the top waiver picks for the week. I've got 5 players. Actually, I've got 6 this week. I've got 2 players in equal 5th spot. Anyway, these are the players I think, if they're available, they're worth throwing a waiver pick at. I think they can bring real value to your side. Number 1 is Brady Hoff for West Coast. I'm not sure if this is it for him, and he's going to be the player we kind of thought he was going to be in terms of a fantasy game. I just know that if this midfield role is real and it's going to continue, you want to have this guy in your team if he pops. Number 2, I've got his teammate Jack Hutchinson. Probably less excited, but that midfield role looks locked away as well. He's had 3 weeks of it now, and I guess he's probably a guy you're going to want to loophole if you can, just because he can score a 40 or a 50. But with forward status, a high tackling game, and a midfield spot that's seemingly his for the time being, I think he'd be a great get. Number 3, Sam Powell-Pepper. If he's available, forget about the past times where he may have burnt you. He's looking the real deal this year. Grab him. Number 4, Thompson Dow for the Tigers. He's a guy I've liked for a while, but he just hasn't had the scoring. And he put up a good score on the weekend, and yeah, that could be the start of something for him. And then number 5, I've got 2 players. The first guy I talked about last week for Fremantle, Carl Warner. And I said last week I wasn't exactly sure what type of player he was. I've just noticed his scoring starting to pick up. And watching him closely on Friday night against the Crows, the whole game I was thinking he really does look like a good player in fantasy. Just his ability to read the ball and the fact that they like to use him as an outlet. Plenty of +6s up for grabs. And I remember thinking, oh, damn, I wish I grabbed him because he's probably going to score really well. It'd be hard to get him. He only scored 60-something, but I don't think that really told the story of how well he played. So I guess what I'm driving at is grab him now before he pops an 80 or a 90, because then everyone else will come looking for him. And then the last guy is, it's a bit of a stretch, this one, but I've just got a really good feeling about Lachie Cowan for Carlton. He scored, I think it was 84 in round one against Richmond, and that was a game where a lot of Blues defenders had a lot of the ball. And then he lost his spot, and he was an emergency last week, so he's getting closer to a recall. But I think he returns this week because Jack Silvani's got a hand issue. He's going to be out for a couple of weeks. They can't swing Zach Williams back because he's injured again, unfortunately, so he's out. And Lockie Young will come back in, I'm sure, but I think Cowan comes in with him. And playing the Crows, who give up a lot of ball to running defenders, I don't know. I reckon there's a time in the future where Lockie Cowan's going to be one of the main men in that Carlton backline in terms of distribution. And we saw it in round one, and then he was poor for a bit, lost his spot. Now he's back. I reckon he's going to be good. So maybe not a waiver wire you'd use necessarily, but if he's a free agent just sitting there, I reckon worth grabbing him this week. We've got a couple of listener questions that I'll run through now, and then I'll wrap up what's been a big episode of Finders Keepers. And this comment comes from Brendan, who is in one of my keeper leagues. A keeper league I started for the Coaches Panel Patreons last year. So we're in our second year. Good group of dudes, lots of fun in the group chat, and a highly competitive league. I nearly made finals last year, and I was hoping to get up there this year, but it's looking like another year down the bottom. Anyhow, Brendan coaches the Moral Victories, and he sent me a message during the week saying, just to let me know of a trade that happened a few years ago in a league that he plays in. So, at the end of Matt Rowe's first season, one guy in his league traded Isaac Heaney and Jack Steele, who was coming off a huge season, for Rowe. I think the guy that got Heaney and Steele has won the last 4 premierships on the back of that trade. Oh, wow. Yeah, it's a cautionary tale, isn't it, about overvaluing a player. Like, if you remember when Matt Rowe debuted, I think, was it the COVID year, 2020? I think it might have been. I remember his first few games thinking, this is the best debut of any kid I've ever seen, ever, and he's probably going to be the best fantasy player of all time. I think we're all thinking it. So I could see why someone would put up, Isaac Heaney a few years ago, he was still stuck as that hybrid forward mid, predominantly forward. And Jack Steele, he'd had a really big year, but he hadn't had that huge year yet. I think it made sense. It's just, cautionary tale, not to get too excited about one player, because since then, both Steele and Heaney have had, at some point, a career high season, and that includes Steele going 120, I think, 120 average in 2021, and then Heaney last year, when he finally became a pure mid, had a huge one as well. But they had career years at some point, and they've been standout players in their line. On the other hand, Rowe has taken not a long time, he's taken a few years to just get to being a safe 90s guy. And he's still building. And we all know that once Rowe gets his outside game improved, he's going to be a huge guy, a 100 guy for sure. But at the moment, he's still a 90s guy, whereas, the other guy got Steele and Heaney and seemingly every premiership since. So not a bad trade at the time, I'm sure, and it probably made sense. And it's obviously not this person's fault that Rowe had the injuries he had. But certainly an interesting trade to look back on. And, that's a good one, Brendan. Thanks for sending that through, mate. Appreciate it. And then we've just got one question that's come through on X from @PatrickDan71167. And his name is Holmes is where the heart is. I do like a good pun, Patrick. I just wish Holmes would lift his game a little bit more. Anyway, that's not the point. So, Patrick's written in and said, just had a first listen to your podcast. Bloody great work. Looking forward to more. Awesome. Thank you. That's really good feedback. And then to the question, who do you think averages more for the rest of the year? Jasper Fletcher, Trent Rivers, or Archie Roberts? Now, this question came through before the weekend, and since then, we've seen, I think all three players score pretty well. Rivers went 110, Fletcher 81, and I reckon Roberts 78. But for the rest of the year, trying to rank them, it's pretty tricky because, especially with Rivers, I'm very hesitant to put trust into Rivers, just the way he started this season. But I do think, looking at those three players and looking at all the permutations, if you will, I do think Rivers will average the most for the rest of this year. I think for a number of factors. One, he's a little bit older than the other two boys, a bit more experienced. And two, he's doing really well off that halfback role again, which is great. But there is also still a chance where he goes into the midfield and becomes a different type of scorer, but still a really good one. I think if I was to rank the second player after Rivers, I'd land on Roberts. And that's really, it's just that I trust him in that role a little bit more, just the way the Bombers' backline's looking. Ridley's not looking up, to being that player he was. I'm talking in the fantasy sense. Mason Redman's not doing it. McGrath is just hot and cold. So I think that role is going to be safe for Roberts. I think he plays it really well. Fletcher's been awesome. I just wonder if Kitty Coleman comes back and some things get shuffled around, if we might see maybe Fletcher get back up on a wing. We already saw earlier in the year Jared Berry went from a wing to halfback, and I know they mix it around. So experience and I reckon role security, feeling secure in whatever role they land in, that they'll still score well. I reckon I'd go Rivers, Roberts, Fletcher. Thanks for sending that in, and thanks for the kind words, Patrick. Glad you're enjoying the pod. If you are also enjoying the podcast, go and like and subscribe wherever you're listening to it. Go and find the page on X at FindKeepAFL to stay up to date with what's happening with the podcast and for any other interesting nuggets that fall across the weekend. And make sure if you have a thought or a question you'd like read out on the podcast, to send it through at FindKeepAFL on X, and you can just post it to the page. Or if you want to stay anonymous, maybe you've got a question that involves someone else who listens to the show in your league and you don't want them to know what you're thinking, you can also send a private message to the Finders Keepers page, and I'll read it on next week's podcast. Thanks for tuning in again. It was a big episode. I feel like it's been a massive few weeks of footy, getting back into probably the more traditional time slots and rounds of footy, and then before we know it, the mid-season bye rounds will be here to completely trip us up once again. All right, I think we're done. Have a good week. I hope all goes well and you get the wins across your leagues in round 8. And I'll be back next week to dissect everything and try and make sense of it for you. In the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers. And until next time, keep on keeping on.